Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Welcome back to Cognitive Neuroscience. Hope you had a good weekend. All right, so today what we're going to do is first we're going to talk about the quiz, and then we got on this topic of place cells and some of these kind of cool effects of what happens to place cells during memory. So I have a few slides on that, and then we're going to put the kibosh on declarative memory, and then switch gears and start talking about speech and language. And today we're going to focus on the speech, especially a lot on speech, how you actually talk and encode and convey information from person to person. And then on Thursday, we're going to probably still continue talking about making speech. And then the latter part of Thursday, we'll talk about how people create speech, right? So there's kind of the sensory side for speech perception, and then we'll transition to the motor side of speech production. So that's the plan for this week. So let's get to the quiz. Maybe. Here we go. I wish Zoom wouldn't give me like 30 possibilities to choose from. I have like a couple of programs open, but it seems to insist on showing like the last 10 that I've opened up for some reason. So at any rate, everybody, I hope you can see the quiz here. All right, question number 1, children with dyslexia. So it's not limited just to reading. Some people with dyslexia may very well have a very narrow problem with reading, and it's most obvious to parents, and it's a cause for concern there. But if you look at them closely, there oftentimes people will have trouble writing as well. And so the areas of the brain that are important for reading and writing are in the same neighborhood, at least. So that may be one kind of reason for that overlap. It also kind of relates to what we were just talking about with speech, right? With reading, that's the perception angle of using the written word, and writing is the output. So that's the analog of speaking. And sometimes those two can go together, and we can also see dissociations, which we'll talk about a little more in more detail when we get to the speech. All right, so for one, you wanted to go with B. So they wouldn't have brain lesions in their visual word form area because dyslexia is developmental. It's something you don't have to have brain damage in any sort of obvious way. Writing is a very unnatural thing to learn. Writing's only been with us for about 3,000 or 4,000 years or so. And most people were illiterate up until the past couple hundred years or so. So it's a very unusual thing that humans invented. In contrast, very few children have difficulty learning how to understand language and create language, which is a minor miracle in and of itself, considering the complexities that we're going to talk about. So it's worthwhile, especially dyslexia is fairly common. I'm sure out of this class of 50 some people, some of you guys are probably diagnosed with dyslexia, and it is, it's a testament to how unusual it is. This skill is unusual, and it's difficult to learn because we're not programmed to do it, so to speak. Whereas, as we'll talk about, language is very natural. The human brain evolved to have that skill. All right, and as far as intelligence, if you look at intelligence tests and relate it to dyslexia, there really isn't any obvious relation. So again, that underlines what I just said, that it's a particular skill that people need to learn in modern society, and sometimes people have trouble doing so. All right, question 2, the system of rules for combining grammatically correct phrases within a language. So with that, we call it syntax. And we'll make a distinction between syntax, which is the rules of grammar, and semantics, which is the content the ideas that you're trying to get across. It's not context modulation. Context, when we're talking about speech and language, context usually means the narrative of what you're talking about, the sentence that you're talking about, phrases within the sentence. So the individual words can fit within these contexts. So that's what we mean by context. But it's not the same thing as syntax. And universal grammar is thought to be one of the mechanisms for what I just said, where kids all across the world, generation after generation, just sort of naturally pick up language. So notice we don't have, unless there's a developmental problem, we don't have speech classes, right? Kids just learn how to talk. It's very remarkable. Whereas you have to read to your child, they always say, parents read to your children every night, which is a good idea. But they don't say speak to your children every night. It's a good idea to acknowledge their existence and talk with them. But it's something that we naturally do anyways. So again, reading is kind of special in that respect. So universal grammar is thought to be kind of this general propensity to learn to use speech and language. But it's general. It's not specific to any one language. The rules of syntax for Japanese are different from the rules of syntax for English, right? And there's all sorts of other languages out there. They're really interesting African languages that have totally different ways of expressing information and different rules of syntax. So there's a wide variety of ways the rules can be done. And there really isn't any correct way. As long as it functions well, then that's what you need. So let's see. So for 2, you wanted to go with syntax. 3, segmenting boundaries between words. So that's generally not hard to do with reading. There's a space there on the page. I guess nowadays I'm in the habit of actually putting in 2 spaces on word in between sentences because I think it's perceptually easier to do. But the thing, I always get these corrections saying I'm breaking the rules and it should be 1 space. But at any rate, as long as there's a space there, then that's a boundary. With writing, same thing. As long as there are spaces there, you can distinguish the letters that go to one word from letters that are to be assigned to a different word. Prosody is the emotional element of speech. So that's really doesn't have anything to do with the boundaries necessarily, although prosody tends to go across boundaries. And by that, I mean, when you're speaking, if you're excited about something and you say a sentence, wasn't that a great ending to the basketball game on Saturday with Gonzaga? Each one of those words had kind of this lilt and emphasis that I gave to it. I didn't say, wasn't it great that the basketball game on Saturday was, that's not the way people talk. Prosody goes across words to convey the emotional tenor of what you're trying to say. So that goes across boundaries. So for 3, the answer is speech perception. That's, as we'll see, is a big problem. We perceive, once you know a language, we perceive this linear set of packaged words, right, that you pull out from the sound that you hear, the sound stream. In reality, those spaces aren't in the speech signal. They're parts within words that have a space and between words that don't have spaces. So this is a major challenge for children to learn where one word stops when they're listening. One word stops and another word begins in speech. So for 3, you wanted to go with B, speech perception. We're going to talk about the McGurk effect in a little while. I have a video on that. And it shows, it's the one where if you change the cues used for visual information, the way somebody is speaking, and you do this, using videos, then you can get dissociations between what they look like they're saying and the sound that you hear. That can influence what you perceive. And it'll make more sense when I show you the video. But the basic McGurk effect shows that speech perception is influenced by what you see, which doesn't have to be the case. It could be modality specific, but the human face and gestures convey useful linguistic information. And so consequently, speech perception is influenced by things other than just the sound of speech. So the McGurk effect isn't the basis for sign language. Sign language, of course, uses visual information. And by the way, it's a full-blown language in and of itself. So it has syntax to it. It has semantics and prosody and all the rest. But nonetheless, it's not the McGurk effect doesn't form a basis for it. And let's see, it shows that words are automatically associated with other words having similar meanings. That's also not the McGurk effect. That relates to semantic memory and the organization of semantic memory. So when you think about, the word huge, maybe the word ginormous is also associated with that. So the McGurk effect, you want to go with C. Question 5, perception and production of speech through life. So that becomes fundamentally shaped by what infants hear. And this is something that you can see, especially if you're in cities where people come from lots of different places. San Antonio is not a bad example of that. We have accents. You can tell, where they come from. Obviously, I'm not from Texas. I'm from the Midwest, so I have a pretty bland accent. That sticks with you. When I moved to Texas, I didn't suddenly develop a Texas twang. Maybe a little bit here and there comes in, but I've been here 5 years and it really hasn't happened yet. My speech, in terms of both production as well as how well I can understand what other people are saying, the perception part, it gets shaped very early on in life. But it's not determined genetically. It's very much about what you're exposed to in the environment, what you hear as a child. That's what shapes speech perception and production. And it's not limited to one language. So if you have a baby in a household where 2 languages are spoken, the general recommendation is go for it. Speak both languages in front of the kid. Kids are really good at absorbing language information, which is called the critical period, and extends up to about age 6 or so. There's no absolute cutoff, but they can really learn language very fast, speech and language very fast, much faster than you and I can since we're older. So at any rate, for question 5, you wanted to go with B. All right, what about split brain patients? So some patients, they show that you can have very basic, rudimentary abilities for language in the right hemisphere. And this is done by presenting words into the left visual hemispace, visual field, which, because the brain has been split in the middle, that information is restricted to going to the right side of the brain. And so typically, as we'll talk about with lesions, if you have right hemisphere lesions, they tend to not lead to catastrophic deficits in language. The main deficit that you see relates to prosody, but you can still understand speech. Syntax is intact, and semantics and so forth. So for some people, language really is strongly localized to the left, but not everybody in the split brain patients show that even under these artificial situations where information is only limited to the right hemisphere, some of them can recognize speech, so they have just very rudimentary speech, not very complicated, but a little bit. So let's see, for 6B, it doesn't show that only the left hemisphere is involved in language. The point I just made shows that that's not correct, even though it's dominant in most people. And for C, only objects presented briefly in the left visual field can be described verbally. No, you can, it's really, you make it easier if you present them longer. So for 6, you wanted to go with A. Aprosodias, so that's absence of prosody. And so that's when you hear somebody who's a very boring speaker and talks in a monotone like this, and that gets old really, really fast. I'm just waiting to see people starting to leave this class. So far, nobody has peeled away yet. But if I talk like that for more than 10 or 15 minutes, it'd be pretty annoying. So it's a very basic part of speech that's important for conveying information in a different way beyond just kind of the by the book meaning of what the words are. It's how they're said, of course, it also matters. So aprosodias, that's C, and that's due to brain damage. I'm not aware of a developmental disorder where people have difficulty with prosody, although sometimes you'll see it in other developmental disorders. You may see it, for example, in autism spectrum disorder. Sometimes those people, but it's not technically aprosody because that's due to brain damage. All right, and autism is a developmental disorder as well. All right, so A, it's not due to damage in the left hemisphere. It's more often, if not always, due to damage in the right. And it's the opposite. It doesn't cause hyper-emotionality. It makes speech hypo-emotional. So for 7, you wanted to go with C. And lastly, 8, temporal components of semantic processing. So if you want to understand the timing of brain activity, right, just think back to our discussion of methods throughout this course, right? Event-related potentials and EEG is usually the best choice if you're interested in timing of brain activity. The WADA test, it doesn't give you a lot of information about time. That's where you can anesthetize one hemisphere of the brain by injecting an anesthetic into one of the carotid arteries. We'll talk about that on Thursday, most likely. fMRI, great for asking questions about where in the brain something may be processed, not as good in terms of when, so timing. And the same thing with PET. If anything, that's the temporal resolution of PET is not even as good as fMRI. So with 8, you wanted to go with D. Okay, any questions about the quiz? All right, moving on. Just trying to find our space. So we left off, I believe, talking about the taxi drivers. Here we go. And then we got into a discussion about place cells. So I have a few more slides here. Here we go, on place cells. So I think I mentioned in passing that in the rat, the hippocampus takes up a much greater proportion of the volume of the brain than it does in humans. And this is just showing you, for those that are interested, this is a rat brain. And this is what it looks like if you look down on top. Note they have these massive olfactory bulbs. So rats, their sense of vision isn't that good in most rats. But they really, smell is kind of their main sensory modality. And so you can see this just in the structure of their brain, that the olfactory bulbs are way, way bigger than what we have. But it's the same basic layout of a brain as what humans have, right? So the visual cortex is back here. Here's the cerebellum hanging off the back. Motor cortex would be somewhere right around in here or so. To the extent that they have prefrontal cortex, it'd be right in here. There's debate about how much they actually have. So they have that standard equipment, standard model mammalian brain. And you can go in and record from cells inside the hippocampus by sticking a piece of metal into the hippocampus. And so that's what's shown here. This is a cross section of the rat brain. Thalamus, for example, is right in here. And the hippocampus, for them, for part of it, it's on top. So that's another major anatomical difference. In humans, as you know, the hippocampus is in the medial temporal lobe. The kind of the traditional way of thinking about this is that in the human brain, the neocortex grew a lot. It evolved and it took up a lot of space. Like I just said with the rats, there's debate on how much neocortex they even have. And so the idea is that this hippocampus was kind of pushed, in a sense, over evolutionary time, pushed down and towards the middle in the human brain. And with rats, I think you can visualize it here. Yeah, this shows it. This is the dorsal, the top part of the hippocampus, and then it goes all the way down and around. In humans, it basically, this whole thing got squashed downwards and towards the midline. So what I'm showing you here is just the very top of the hippocampus. And this picture, I have to admit, this is from when I was in graduate school. And just to show you kind of what the olden days were like, this was right before digital cameras. So I had to literally use a camera with film and took a picture through a microscope to get a picture of the slide. And the problem was he had to use something called a reticle to get a sense of kind of, so you could see what the camera was seeing through its lens system. And you had to get those things to match up right for the picture to get in focus. And the reticle never always perfectly matched the camera. So I always had to mess around to get it in focus. And I took this picture. I went to the quick, whatever, 24-hour photo developing place. I think I took like 3 trips to get one picture that was in focus. And so I figured let's use that picture a lot to make it worthwhile. So that's what we're looking at here. But this is a nice picture of the rat hippocampus. These are different subregions of the hippocampus. And then these are all this black line here. Those are cells that took up a stain, a Nissl stain, and you use that to reveal where the cells are. And then you can show where you stuck your electrode to record them. All right, so we already talked about that when you do that and you have a rat walk around an open arena, there's a really good chance in the hippocampus that the cell will fire, a given cell will fire at a certain location within the arena and not other locations. So that's a place cell. So we talked about that before. And it's worth thinking about variability here, that these are just firing rates. This is the purple is when the cell's firing really fast, yellow is when it's firing hardly at all, and the other colors are somewhere in between. But there's a lot of variability here. So it's not as if if you were reading out the activity of one cell and you knew that it fired 10 action potentials in the last second, you can't say for sure that that rat is here or here or here. It may be unlikely to be where the yellow is, but those few action potentials in that short period of time isn't enough to give you a clear answer to the question of where is the rat. So this is a property of all the cells. It's underdetermined. Different locations in the arena can have that same 10 spike per second firing rate, at least for brief periods of time. So how might the rat brain deal with this computational problem? Well, one way is that you can think about reading out the activity of not just one cell, but multiple cells. So if we think about this, we're trying to read out, make an inference about where the rat is located in space by reading out activity from more than one cell. So I think I briefly talked about this before, but this is kind of laying it out a little more clearly because it relates to what we're going to talk about next. That if the rat really is here in the X, you can think about this cell 1 should be firing at a fairly high rate, and cell 2 shouldn't be firing hardly at all, right? So knowing what cell 1 and cell 2 are doing in terms of firing action potentials gives us more information to answer the question, where is the rat, based on the activity of these two cells. And you can just keep going and add in more and more cells to further constrain the possibilities for where this rat is likely to be inside the arena. And this is really important from the rat's point of view to keep oriented in space, right? They need to, just like us, you want to know where you're at. It's very useful for getting around in the world, avoiding places you don't want to go, getting to places you do want to go. Being oriented is vital for that. All right. So one of the studies, the Wilson and McNaughton one that I alluded to earlier on Thursday, they calculated this. And it turns out that you don't have to have a whole lot of these place cells going at the same time or not going, but just being measured to predict fairly accurately where the rat was located in space. It's this exponentially declining function. Now, I didn't put in the exact number of cells because it varies with a lot of their physiological properties, but we're talking tens to hundreds of cells or so is sufficient to get useful information out of that population. So that's called the population code. Another way of stating that is that information about where the rat is in space is distributed amongst a group of cells. It's not localized to only one cell. And then if other parts of the brain that use this spatial signal, which they do, can read out this code, then they can have a very fine-grained idea of where the rat is in the world. So it's similar, it's like voting, right? You can ask one or two people how they voted, but that's not necessarily going to tell you kind of which candidate won the race, right? But if you have a sample of that, you get a survey, then you can have a much better idea about kind of how people people think about the candidates. It's not foolproof, obviously, but it gives you a much more valid estimate of public sentiment. And here, when you have a whole bunch of cells all kind of voting, you get a much better sense of where the rat is in space for the same reason. Okay, is that clear? All right. So we left off, or at least we started thinking about on Thursday, well, if you have a bunch of these cells together and the rat is walking around, one cell will fire when the rat is here. And as the rat keeps moving, let's say in this direction from left to right, you'll have the cell, I just color coded it here. The cell A is color code is red, and then yellow, and then blue, green, or blue, black, and then orange. So you'd have this cell fires, this cell fires, this cell, this cell, this cell. You've got a sequence. You've got a behavioral sequence going from left to right, and you've got a neural response overlap to some degree. The place fields are oftentimes, they smoosh over each other. Oh, my connection may be going out. Come on, you can do it. Stay. All right. And so what's remarkable is you can let Joe Rat walk back and forth on this track. Sometimes they have them go around in a square track, and they do all sorts of different things, or like a figure 8. And the rat will eventually go to sleep, particularly when humans, we like to stay up during the day. Rats sleep during the day under normal circumstances. So there's a good chance if you put them in your experiment and you start recording them walking around, after a while, they may just be tired of it and say, I'm going to go take a nap. But you can still record the activity of these cells in the hippocampus. And what you get is shown below, that when the rat is sleeping, these cells will still fire in sequence. And that's what's shown here. Each one of these vertical lines is supposed to be color coded. It's a little hard to see, but you can see there's yellow versus the green there, to match the color code of the cells that were the same cells that were recorded when the rat was walking around. And you see within the order of the firing, you get this cell first, then this one, then that one, that one, that one, and so forth. So that's pretty cool. There's also data suggesting that this can go backwards. And people have suggested that that may be involved in kind of learning to learning the route kind of backwards. It's sort of like reinforcement learning. Once you get from where you start to where your goal is, then you get reinforced for the previous steps, and you start with the most recent one and then go back in time. But these data, this one at least seemed to show the rat going forward. But note the time scale here. So this is probably 280 centimeters or something like that. And so a foot is about 30 centimeters or so, something like that. So we're talking, this is about 8 feet or so. And so rats typically, when they walk, it'll take them, I don't know, let's say it took them 5 seconds to walk 8 feet. Here, the time scale was way faster when the animal is sleeping. These are milliseconds. So less than 200 milliseconds, right? 1/5 of a second. These cells all fire in sequence. So this is like rapid fire, bloop, 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 way faster than it took in real time for the animal to physically walk from one side of this track to another one. So that's another feature of the activity during sleep. If it does relate to plasticity or learning of routes, it's really sped up, which is also pretty cool. There's other electrical activity inside the hippocampus that varies at the same time as these individual cell activities. So there's kind of like this background activities, these waves, they're called sharp waves, that kind of organize the timing of the firing of the cells. So it's sort of like if you play music and you have somebody clapping on the beat, right? It's a similar sort of thing that's thought to synchronize the activity of the cells, and then the cell firing can be precisely regulated relative to that beat. And for some situations, the cells will kind of move ahead of the beat or behind the beat as the animal's walking. So there's a whole lot of really cool physiology going on in the hippocampus. We just started to scratch the surface, but I thought you might, as we discussed the other day, I thought some of you guys might be interested in digging in a little deeper. So there you go. I think that's the last one that I put in here. Yes. All right. So that's it for declarative memory. Are there any questions or comments at this point before we switch gears and start talking about speech and language?
No, sir.
All right. Leave it at that. Come on. Okay. So I don't know if I mentioned Pinker to you guys before, but he's one of my favorite science writers. For those of you that are all interested in writing, even forget about the science, but just writing and reading good writing, you may want to check out some of his books. He also has a book on writing, which I found very helpful in working to develop as a writer. And that's another thing they don't tell you when you go to grad school, usually. If you're a scientist, you're going to be a writer. You're a professional writer in that you write articles, you sometimes write books, you write reports, you write a lot every day. And so it's an important skill, I think, to develop for those of you that are interested in going to graduate school. and Pinker has some pretty useful writings on that. You can also email me. I have a whole bunch of resources here on writing that I share with graduate students. So if you guys are interested, I'd be happy to also share them with you. And Pinker studies language. That's his main, as far as a research topic goes, that's his main thing. Although he writes books that are pretty popular that go out to a lot of other directions as well. All right, so let's think about communication and language. And one of the things I like about this, this class is that it forces us to slow down and think about some of these miracles that happen just around us. Of course, they're not miracles. They're the product of Mother Nature that it took a long time for our brains to work the way they do. But one of these we talked about is just how do babies learn speech? It's really complicated for anybody that's taken a second language course or tried to learn it. You know, once you're out of your single digit years, it gets a lot harder to pick it up, but yet babies just kind of naturally do it. They'll start babbling right away. Most children around 2 years old or so, you know, they'll have a few words and they'll be able to learn, you know, they're starting to learn how to communicate. And if anything, their language, their speech comprehension is better than speech production, which we'll talk about this a little bit on Thursday, but there are many muscles involved in speech, about 70 some, they're called articulators, 70 some muscles that all need to be coordinated with millisecond precision. It's one of the hardest, if not the hardest motor act that humans are capable of doing. So that's one reason why when you're talking around little kids, they're probably taking in more than they express. So just FYI for parents out there. All right, so let's think about this. You know, what's really going on with speech and language, and how might that differ for humans versus other animals, right? So with humans, we use a set of arbitrary symbols to represent concepts, and these are used for communication. And so these sounds that I'm making right now, they're mostly arbitrary. If we think about sounds that are used for speech, so there are only certain types of sounds that humans can make for speech that languages use. And so there's this wide range of sounds that you can make vocally, and languages sample subsets of that range to use for speech. But the assignment is, in most instances, arbitrary. So when I say cup, there's nothing about the sound cup that dictates it has to relate to anything about a container that holds fluids that you can drink. It's just a word that we assign. We just arbitrarily assign it. Other languages use different words for the same concept. So that's what I mean by arbitrary symbols. Same thing with words. There's no reason why a C shape and a U shape and a P shape has to mean cup. We could use some other letters, right? It doesn't really matter from that perspective. As long as you have some symbol that stands for, it's a proxy for the idea of cup, and other people recognize that that's what that symbol means, which is critical, then you can have language. So that brings us to our second point here, that for communication language, there's a sender and a receiver. So the listener in some ways needs to decode what the sender is delivering to them. So if I say the word cup, that it's basically packaging up this concept of cup. It's in my brain, it's an abstract idea, and I'm making it into a physical form of sound waves, a pattern of sound waves. That's the package. That package is going into this Logitech microphone in here, out through the interweb, out of your speakers and into your ears. And then that package is transformed into neural code by way of hearing, as we talked about several weeks ago, and transformed in turn into the concept of cup. That whole process happened within milliseconds, right? Most people speak around 3 to 4 words per second or so, sometimes much faster, and you can still understand it. That's really rapid. And that whole process, every step along that way, there can be problems that make it difficult. Yet we're very good at recognizing speech. You can recognize speech, for example, at a party. You have all this background noise, yet you're still able to talk with somebody and decode what they're saying. usually pretty well, as long as the background noise isn't too loud. And if you can see them talking, that offers additional visual cues that you can also use to understand what they're saying. All right, but if the sender and receiver aren't on the same page as far as what these packages, these symbolic packages mean, then you'll never be able to talk to one another. So you have to have this agreed upon convention. And that convention falls along at least two lines, right? One of the main ones is semantics. What does the word cup mean? You know, we all have to agree, if we're going to talk about cups, what cup means. And the other is syntax. When we talk in the form of sentences, where does the noun go to understand this? So if I were to try to explain cup, but I didn't use the rules of grammar in English, you can maybe sort of figure out what I'm saying. This happens, you know, if people from another country that don't speak English come here, you can kind of figure it out. And then if we go to another country and don't speak that language, other people can sort of figure out what we're saying, as long as you have some of the basic words out there, but it's really difficult and it doesn't work well in many instances. So you have to have these agreed upon conventions and have it operate well in order to have smooth communication. All right, so this is one of these topics that people just love talking about. I'll bet it's the topic of lots of late night dorm room conversations. Scientists love talking about it, arguing about it. And so I just wanted to kind of, so we bring this up so we could think about it, right? You know, as far as human language goes versus other species. So maybe we can just sort of take a poll of the class out there. So if you had to go from kind of, you know, 1 to 10, where 1 is human language is no different from any other animal speech, and I shouldn't even say speech, animal communication. And 10 meaning we're so special, you know, nobody's even in the same category as us. Where do you think human language would fall along that continuum?
Like 6 or 7,
6 or 7, okay.
just because we can consider like math and stuff.
We consider, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
We can consider math like
Oh,
math is its own language in that sense, and so you know, and that's why I always thought we were a little advanced compared to like, you know, animals. But
yeah, interesting. That's the first time anyone's brought up kind of the math angle to all this, but yeah, in that there is, yeah, this is where we're getting kind of that late night dorm conversations as far as discovering math is out there to be discovered, but it's very, you know, it's systematic, and at least at a very practical level, mathematicians need to have an agreed upon set of symbols in order to communicate with one another and have proofs and so on. So if one person thinks that, you know, this means plus, another person thinks this means minus, well, you know, their math won't be, it's incommensurate. They wouldn't be able to, you know, even just do simple math and explain that to each other. So yeah, there are a lot of similarities there with math as far as having this agreed upon convention and syntax and semantics as well. Yeah, interesting. Some other thoughts? Do we have any extreme people? It's, you know, I don't have a number in mind that's the right one. I don't know, you know, what it would be. Any extreme, you know, human language, we're so special, forget all those other animals, we're, you know, in a different class entirely. Or human language, well, you know, it's we like to think we're special, but we're really not all that special.
Well, I would be of the opinion that we're more similar to other animals just because we utilize a lot of the same structures and tools to produce language and communicate. So there is that commonality, but the differences lie within the mental cognition and how we're able to process and think about concepts outside of the present time.
Okay.
So
yeah, so maybe some of the basic hardware and software is common to other animals, but we have these more sophisticated cognitive faculties to think more abstractly, maybe, and that might be the difference.
yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, some other ideas? Anybody want to take we're not so special?
feel that way sometimes.
Oh. Do we need to beef up your self-esteem? This isn't counseling. This is cognitive neuroscience. This is hard science, people. No, you're doing great. All right. Yeah, it's a harder argument to make, but there are certain commonalities that maybe humans don't take into account, right? So other animals certainly can communicate well. For example, other monkeys and other primates, they have systems of communicating very clear ideas as far as predators are coming. They have calls that would say, okay, here's an eagle or a large bird coming, that watch out, stay down, or look out, here comes the panther. So you do have these kind of rudimentary signals that can be shared with the entire community. And it is a sound that's mapped onto comprehending a specific idea. How do you know it's a specific idea? So if the call goes out for the birds, the monkeys will duck down. If the call comes out that there's some sort of lion nearby or something, they'll go up in the trees, right? So you can show behaviorally that there's understanding of these various calls. And there's a lot of kind of, in some ways, in their books on this about kind of culture in primate communities, different primates. And so you can kind of even see little differences in some of these calls, as I understand it. So there are similarities there. Some of the big differences are that we don't have this open loop feature that we have with language. Language is continually growing and changing. I mentioned, I used the word ginormous earlier in talking about semantic memory. At one point, that wasn't a word, right? Every year you may have come across the Oxford English Dictionary and Webster's, they say, okay, we're going to admit some new words into our dictionary. They become real words now. But it works from the ground up, typically, that people coin a term. And ginormous, I remember when I first heard about that, it was more kind of a joke, it was a funny word, but now it's kind of taken on the status of a real bona fide word that's in our language. Other words, they tend to fall away. They're not used very often at all. They fall out of fashion, right? But the open loop part, the generative part, is one thing that separates or distinguishes human language from animal language. They don't have that creative aspect in the way that humans have. We have an extensive syntax. So animals may have some rudimentary grammar, very rudimentary, but humans, it can be really sophisticated. For those of us that you took English class and you had to diagram sentences and learn about what a dangling participle is. I don't remember what the heck a dangling participle is. I'd have to think about it because it doesn't really matter when you're writing, but it is something you can go in and know about. I shouldn't say it doesn't matter. It's good to know that stuff, but it's not necessary to write. So there is this intricate organization of syntax that human language has that animal communication doesn't necessarily have. Humans, as well as other animals, I'm trying to move towards, okay, some commonalities as well. We have gestures. We have other nonverbal ways of communicating, and certainly you see that in lots all throughout the animal kingdom as well. So there are these kind of maybe more similarities than we tend to think about, but there are these really important differences, and especially the open loop part and the grammar part are two aspects that really put a lot of space in between what human language is like and what humans can do with it versus what other animals can do. But it's something, I think it's important to think about. And it gets at the question, where did human language come from to begin with? Which is another one of these issues that hasn't been resolved, and scientists argue a lot about it. So here's an example of an intricate communication system that's quite different from the way humans communicate. Sometimes I think if I had my way, I'd like to spend like the first month just talking about insect cognition in this class. But not everybody's interested in insect cognition as I am, so I don't do it. But here's a little bit, because keep in mind, bees don't really have brains in the way we think of brains. They have ganglia, so they have neurons, they fire action potentials, they have all the physiology that we've been talking about. But there's far fewer neurons, far fewer cells in their heads than are in our heads or in the mammalian brains. Yet they can do remarkable things, some things that like feats of navigation, for example, that humans would have trouble doing. And in terms of communication, they're known for their dancing because that's how they encode information. They have a concept in their little bee head, and they can communicate that to their buddies in the colony. So how does this work? So let's say a bee's out just on patrol, trying to find a water source or food, or maybe a good site to move the hive. And they find something. Let's say they find a food source, a bunch of flowers, let's say. They fly back to the hive and they land on the wall of the hive, and then they proceed to do a dance. And literally it goes in a figure 8 on the wall of the hive. And in this middle part, it's sort of like dancing at the weddings where people stand around on either side and then people dance in the middle, go one by one, or think 1970s disco movies. So at any rate, in this middle part, they make buzzes and they waggle, they shake their little bee booty around, and that codes for information about the direction, or I'm sorry, the distance to the food source, let's say. And the angle on the wall that they take codes the direction relative to the hive of this food source. So here we have, again, these symbolic acts. They're symbolizing the distance and direction in the real world by virtue of how they dance on the wall of their hive, right? So it's abstract. So this is an example of how we have our bee dance over here, and I tilted it over to point in this direction. And this is showing, here's the hive, that this is the direction relative to the sun, by the way. I should have mentioned that the reference point is the sun for the direction, where the food source is. And they can do things that are even more remarkable than that. So on top of this abstract language-like or communication that they're engaging in, they can also keep track of time. And so researchers will capture the bee flying back. Let's say the bee's over here, gets the food source, it's flying back to the hive, and some researcher gets them in a cup, puts them off to the side for an hour. So now the sun has moved over that hour. You take the bee out, it takes into account the difference in where the sun is. So let's just say the sun is now over here. So this angle is greater than 80 degrees. Then the bee will take that into account and change the angle of its dance on the wall. It's called an ephemeris function. It shows that bees can tell time. So it's pretty cool.
Am I mistaken, or are they able to determine like the quality or quantity or any other factors of like what they find when they communicate? Like, let's say they find a large field of flowers. Right. Are they able to communicate and encode that we need more to go to this area, or this is of high quality?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, I'm sure the answer is no. Somebody knows it, but it's not me. Or at least maybe I knew it and then I'm not recalling it. But yeah, that's something that is fire up Google Scholar, and I'm sure somebody has looked into that. My intuition is I wouldn't be surprised if that's also encoded in some way, but I don't know. Yeah, I have a review article from probably about 10 years ago, all about bee cognition that I thought was really good. So if anybody's interested in that, just email me and I could give you some pointers on where to start. Oh yeah, so we're talking about some differences, kind of like cultural differences. So bees really don't have, excuse me, like culture in the way that humans would have culture, but there are differences in species and the nature of this code. So the distance is coded by the duration of these waggling and buzzing. For species that have larger ranges, they can have a different code, different ranges, short ranges versus long ranges. They can have different codes for the distance. So for 300 meters or so, for one species, they may just have a duration of about 2 seconds or so. Another species, it would have almost 3 seconds duration. So the specifics of the bees and particularly their range, that's also baked into their symbolism, right? So if this bee over here were to eavesdrop with these bees, it would misunderstand how far away the hive is based on the duration of the buzzes and waggling. So it does show some specificity with the specific group of bees that we're talking about. But the bees haven't elaborated on, you got your figure 8 dance. They're not doing, whatever, the mashed potato or the woggle or whatever. They're stuck with pretty much their same dance. And so that shows that it's a closed system, right? They're not really introducing new concepts. They're not introducing innovation into their system, but it works really well in a restricted way. It does what it's designed to do very well. All right, so any questions or comments about bee dance before we move on? Okay, so this is a model that we're going to just, a very simple model that we're going to be working with for the next couple of days that puts together speech perception and production. And like all models, it's a map, it's not the terrain. So there are differences here that aren't shown in the model once you start digging into the literature. But to a first approximation, it's useful for our purposes and it's accurate enough for our purposes right now. We can think about perception and production as being kind of the same basic processes, only done in 2 different directions. So with speech production, you begin with a concept, a message, something that you want to say, which is very mysterious, right? If you think about how do you know, where does that come from? When you want to say something, where does that come from? Well, I don't know about you, but for me, it just kind of appears. I don't know exactly what in the world I'm going to say right now. I'm probably going to say something next because I don't want to just have this awkward silence for the next 10 minutes of class. All right, so I'm going to say something. Turns out I decided to put in a little bit of silence. I didn't know I was going to do that. I just kind of did it, right? So you've had the same idea. Where did these concepts come from? It's a very deep mystery. We have some ideas. When we get to consciousness, we may bring this back up again. But the concept in some way just kind of appears. But once we get beyond that concept of what it is to be communicated, then as researchers, we know a lot more about what happens next. So what happens next is that you have to select lexical information. Lexical is just a term meaning language. And so 2 of the main types we've already discussed. Semantic information, you need to have this concept and clothe it in a specific meaning, a specific way of conveying that meaning. So that is getting the right word. If the concept is cup, at least presumably there's some amorphous concept of a cup. But if you want to communicate that amorphous concept that lives in your head, you want to get it out of your head and into somebody else's, you need to make some sort of symbol out of it. It could be a written symbol, it could be a speech symbol. Right now we're talking about speech. So we have a word that needs to be assigned to that. And also syntax, knowledge about how this symbol, how the word will fit into a sentence, because most of the time we don't just grunt out single words. Sometimes that works great, but a lot of times you want to have a full sentence. So you need to know where that word would fit into the sentence so it can be understood by somebody else. All right. Having accomplished that, or maybe kind of somewhat in parallel and overlapping with that, is phonological selection. Once you have the lexical selection of, okay, I'm going to say the word cup. And again, this is not something you're consciously working through. It's just part of the mechanics of speaking that we're not consciously aware of. You need to map that concept, the lexical selection of cup, onto sounds. So in English, the sound would be cup. So there's another mapping going on here, right? So we're talking about cognitive representations of meaning and syntax that get transformed or operate on to generate another representation of the sound of the word that you're going to say. And at this point, prosody enters the picture as well, how you're going to say the word. If somebody says how they're doing, if we go with the single word sentence, how are you doing? If they say great versus great, well, it's probably, yeah, they're both the words great, but the second word, time I said great, they probably weren't really feeling very great. So sarcasm is prosody. Emotion is prosody. And then at that point, we have a motor program for what needs to be done. And then that sets into motion this complex series of muscle contractions, starting with your diaphragm, right? You need to regulate the air that's going up and out of your mouth in order to say these words. And only at that point does articulation take place, sound waves are produced. That's a whole lot for production. Now, we have this sound wave. We can turn this whole thing around and start with the speech sound, and we want to arrive at this concept, a message, right? So if somebody else is speaking, there's a message to be conveyed. And so we turn it around, right? We don't have the motor part of actually speaking right now. The speech sound goes into your ears, and it gets mapped onto or decoded in terms of what the word would mean. This is word recognition, and then also recognizing prosody, recognizing, you know, sarcasm in somebody else, or recognizing the emotional tenor of what somebody else is saying. And then that gets mapped onto lexical information, semantic information, syntactic information. So we can recognize word sounds in a foreign language. And if you don't know that language, you could say, yeah, that sounds like a word. I don't know what it means though. So the meaning part comes next, this lexical recognition, as well as also perceiving or recognizing how the word would fit into a sentence, because most of the time multiple words are given in each sentence. And only at that point do you get this message that the person was communicating, this message that in some mysterious way popped into being in somebody's cognitive system, gets conveyed through the air with sound to that same message popping into existence in your cognitive system now. And it's really, really just an amazing thing that happens. And we don't think about it, you know, just with me talking, it's going from my head over here to your head over there on the order of a couple hundred milliseconds. Pretty cool. All right, we have 3 more minutes, so I think we can make this next point. In the quiz, we talked about boundaries, and your perception most likely is that I'm saying a bunch of words, one right after the other, like a train, a bunch of cars, each word is one of the cars. But if you hold up a microphone to somebody talking and you record what they said, and then you look at the actual speech waveform. So this is showing time on the x-axis and the amplitude of the sound pressure on the y-axis. And you look at this waveform, you don't see this clear train boxcar type division where each word has a bunch of waveforms going, and then there's a space with nothing going on and another word. So you hear this is A, this all runs together. This is a glad time indeed. Yeah, it's a pretty square sentence they put in your book. But whatever, it makes the point. And so you can see here that there are some spaces. Let's see, is there a decent example here? Well, at the beginning of the glad, you can see there's not a whole lot of sound energy here, even though the G is part of the glad. That's all one word. I'll show some other examples that maybe make the point better, that within words there can be space, there can be these areas with very little acoustic activity, yet you perceive it as one word. And then you can have a bunch of words all run together, which is what we saw at the beginning of the sentence. So this is a major problem. When people started, when speech perception really came to the forefront in psychology in the 1950s, the initial thought was that we would be able to just be able to kind of read out from the acoustic signal what the speech is. And people tried very hard to do that. People also tried to use arbitrary sounds that are not speech sounds and train people to use that as a language. That also was a massive failure, that humans seem to be pre-programmed to take into account certain kinds of sounds for speech purposes. And if you use just arbitrary ones, let's think about Morse code, for example. You know, there's a reason why Morse code, you know, the dots and dashes, the beeps and boops and so on, didn't catch on. It's really, really hard to communicate that way. You can train over many hours to learn how to do Morse code, but most people aren't going to be doing that. It needs to be intuitive, and what's intuitive are the subset of sounds that are created by the human vocal apparatus that are speech sounds. Now, it's not a total mess in that there are regularities in speech. And so this is showing another one I got from von Opsel over here. Your test starts now. I don't like that either. It kind of stresses people out. Your test is not starting now, but there's probably an association with hearing those words. It's probably negative. But at any rate, so you can see here, test, there's spaces here within the word test, right here. Right here is very good. There's almost no sound energy between the S and the T part of test, yet it's all one word. So you can analyze this in more detail by breaking out the frequencies. Think about this like a piano, just like the cochlea. We talked about how the cochlea is arranged like a piano and it has low frequencies. One part of the cochlea is sensitive to low frequencies and mid frequencies and high frequencies. This is all we're doing here, only on a computer. And you can see that when people say words like your, there's a set of upward sweeps. The frequency is going up over time. You see that? Going up here. Here's maybe an even better example for the word starts. This lilting frequency going upwards. It's called the frequency modulation. These are called formants. And so the structure in the speech is very important for distinguishing different words. And so we'll talk a little bit more about formants later when we get to perception on Thursday now, because we're almost out. Actually, we are out of time. Yikes. All right, so I guess I better stop there. So point, difficult to extract speech information from speech signals, not impossible. All right, so are there any questions before we close for today? All right, we'll pick this up on Thursday. See you later.
Thank you.
Bye.